Member Mike, 1, 2. Member Mike, test, 1, 2, 3. Member Mike, test, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Test, test, test. Oh, yes, they do. Witness Mike, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3.
Testing, 1, 2. Mic check for the court reporter. Testing, 1, 2. 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing. Sound check, audio check. You see any jump? Okay. I had done something different yesterday with my testing, testing, 1, 2. No. Sound check for the court reporter. You crank it up, 1, 2, 3. Testing, sound check, 1, 2, 3. Court reporter, sound check, audio check. That's what I was saying to you. Remember my check, did that help? Did the adjustment help on the writer? 1, 2, 3. Keep going, stop. Okay. Testing, 1, 2. 1, 2, 3. Testing, testing.
Witness mic 1, witness mic 1. Witness mic 2, witness mic 2. Witness mic 3, witness mic 3. Witness mic 4, witness mic 4. Witness mic 1. Witness mic 2. Witness mic 3. Witness mic 4. Member mic 1, 2, 3. Mic test at new setting, mic test at new setting. Witness mic test at new setting, witness mic test at new setting, test, test, test. Test, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
The commission will come to order, and good morning. I thank you all for being here this morning, and I want to especially thank our tremendous ambassador at large for international religious freedom, a former governor, a former senator, a former House member, and a man who has accomplished so much and has been absolutely indomitable in fighting for religious freedom. And I want to thank Ambassador Brownback for being here, but more importantly, for his leadership on the world stage. It is extraordinary, and you inspire all of us. So thank you, Mr. Ambassador. We are here today to focus attention on the persecution of Christians worldwide as part of the ongoing work that the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission does on promoting international religious freedom. Again, I would like to thank my co-chair, Jim McGovern, who I know shares a passion for human rights and protection for those who are downtrodden. Like many of you, the news that Christians in Sri Lanka were killed in a series of coordinated bombings on Easter Sunday saddened and sickened me, as I'm sure it did you. As shocking as such news was, however, I cannot say that it was surprising. Or as John Allen, the author of The Global War on Christians, penned in a Washington Post op-ed following the Sri Lanka attack, he said, in part, "The shocking thing about the carnage is that it is not shocking, and it instead forms part of an ugly, predictable global pattern," close quote. For me, it harkened back to the news as to how on Christmas Eve in 2000, a series of coordinated explosions killed Indonesian Christians in Jakarta and elsewhere. We also saw the same thing happening in Egypt during the Easter holiday, where Coptic Christian churches were firebombed. Easter and Christmas, the two holiest days of the Christian calendar, days when I am sure many of the people in this room have been to church with their families. Indeed, John Allen reminds us how Easter and Christmas become the killing seasons for Christians around the world. The Easter bombings in Nigeria in 2012, which killed 41 worshipers. The Palm Sunday bombings, as I referenced a moment ago, in Egypt in 2013, which killed a similar number. Today's focus on anti-Christian persecution is not meant to minimize the suffering of other religious minorities who are imprisoned or killed for their beliefs. I would note parenthetically that I have held dozens of hearings over the years, and Marco Rubio and I last fall co-chaired a hearing as co-chairs of the China Commission on the horrific violence being committed against the Muslim Uyghurs. And we had one young woman testify who talked about the torture inside of those prisons. And it was mind-boggling that in 2018, that's when this hearing occurred, and it continues to today, such concentration camps, and they really are, could be up and running to commit genocide against the Muslims in the autonomous region. Today's focus on anti-Christian persecution is part of a series. I would note parenthetically that I had my first hearing when we took control of the House after 40 years of being a minority party. And my first hearing on religious persecution was on the growing tide of anti-Semitism, and a couple of weeks later it was on the global rising tide of anti-Christianity and persecution. So this is part of the long-standing effort by me and many others, including our distinguished ambassador. There's the equal opportunity that we see. State-sponsored persecution of religion, which characterizes Xi Jinping's China. The vivisection and harvesting of organs from Falun Gong practitioners while still alive, and something now apparently is happening to Uyghurs too. The suppression of the culture of Tibetan Buddhists and systematic razing of Christian churches. In December of last year, I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post on December 28th, and entitled it, or they did, but I wrote the op-ed, "The World Must Stand Against China's War on Religion." And I stated in part, and I think it bears repeating, the ruling Communist Party in China has undertaken the most comprehensive attempt to manipulate and control or destroy religious communities since Chairman Mao Zedong made the eradication of religion a goal of his disastrous Cultural Revolution half a century ago. Now Xi Jinping, apparently fearing the power of independent religious belief as a challenge to the Communist Party's legitimacy, is trying to radically transform religion into the party's servant, employing a draconian policy known as Synodization. Not a household word, but it ought to be. Synodization. Under synodization, all religions and believers must comport with and aggressively promote communist ideology or else. To drive home the point, religious believers of every persuasion are harassed, arrested, jailed, or tortured. Only the compliant are left relatively unscathed. Bibles are burned, churches are destroyed, crosses set ablaze atop church steeples, and now under Xi Jinping, religious leaders are required to install facial recognition cameras in their places of worship. New regulations expand restrictions on religious expression online and prohibit people under the age of 18 from attending services. Government officials are also reportedly rewriting religious texts, including the Bible, that remove content unwanted by the atheist Communist Party, and they have launched a 5-year synodization plan for Chinese Protestant Christians. This commission and this country stands for the human dignity and respect for life, whomever is oppressed. And this commission has and will continue to highlight the suffering of whether it be the Baha'i, as I said before, and all of the Rohingya in Burma, anyone who is under such siege. However, Christians remain the most persecuted religious group in the world, and thus deserve the special attention that today's hearing will give them. As Ambassador at Large Sam Brownback will say today, according to a recent study by Pew, Christians face the most widespread harassment of any religious group targeted in 144 countries globally. We can also make an observation. Sometimes there's an oversensitivity about focusing on Christians, perhaps because we in the United States and the West come from a traditionally Christian background, and we don't want to be accused of playing favorites. Thus, we tend to overcompensate by ignoring or minimizing Christian persecution. And that is, I think, a major, major mistake, and it's not fair to anyone, including the Christians. As John Allen reminds us and I quote him here, of the world's 2.2 billion Christians, roughly 2/3 live outside the developed West. The majority are poor. Many live in rough neighborhoods where religious freedom is more honored in the breach rather than the observance. Often those Christians are also belong to ethnic, linguistic, and cultural minorities, meaning they are doubly or triply at risk. It is an even-handed commitment to raising up the oppressed, and that's what this hearing is seeking to do. I'd like to yield to my good friend and colleague, Mr. Bilirakis, for any comments.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. And thanks for all your good work over the years. You're really outstanding. You truly do care for religious minorities. So anyway, good morning and welcome, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you so much for holding this important hearing, sir, with a preeminent panel of witnesses on an issue that is very near and dear to my heart. I'm proud to be part of this commission while also serving as a co-chair of the International Religious Freedom Caucus. It is wonderful to work in a bipartisan fashion with my colleagues who are committed to raising awareness and ending the scourge of religious persecution. I have made it a feature of my service in the United States House of Representatives to be a voice for all religious minorities, wherever they may be persecuted in the world, from Cuba to China. Egregious injustices perpetrated against the faithful, particularly Christians in the Middle East, are unacceptable in a civilized world and must end today. Together with you, I will continue to support this inalienable right to freedom of religion and expression recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that applies to all people. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from the witnesses.
Thank you
I
very
yield
much,
back.
Mr. Bilirakis.
Thank you.
I'd like to now introduce Ambassador Brownback to the commission. He was sworn in as Ambassador at Large on February 1st of 2018. Prior to that, served as governor of Kansas from 2011 to 2018. He also served as a U.S. Senator and U.S. Member of the House of Representatives from Kansas. While a member of the Senate, he worked actively on the issue of religious freedom in multiple countries, and along with the great Frank Wolf, was one of the key sponsors of the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. And again, Mr. Ambassador, thank you for the report that was just issued on Friday I've gone through it very carefully. It is, again, I think, an extraordinarily comprehensive, and it's an action plan, so thank you for that. He's also been a White House Fellow in the Office of U.S. Trade Representative back in 1990 to 91. Prior to his public service, Ambassador Brownback was a private attorney in Kansas and taught ag law at Kansas State University, co-authoring 2 books on the subject. He earned a BS from Kansas State University and a JD from the University of Kansas. He and his wife, Mary, have 5 children. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. Congressman Bill Walkus, good to see you again as well. I got a chance to visit with the chairman a little bit before we came in, and now that I'm in State Department, I noted to him the number of things there that have his fingerprints on them. They're substantial and impactful, and so for a career in the Congress, well done. And you got more to come. But you've just done an amazing amount of things. I think back early on in the fights on religious freedom, even getting the Frank Wolf bill through, and the early ones that people, well, we don't want to get foreign policy engaged with religion, and the pushback that was taking place then. But then eventually people kind of come around to it, and now it's a prominent feature, and people are saying, well, how do you expect to be able to deal with foreign policy if you don't understand the culture and deal with the religion? Most people in the world are religious. They base their set of values upon a set of religious beliefs. And religion, instead of declining, is increasing around the world, and its intensity is, and the engagement is. So it's really was a great breakthrough 20 years ago to pass the bill that created this office and that report that we just put out this past week. And I think it's really coming of age now in an important time where we are leading the world on this effort. I invite both of you and everybody in this room to the ministerial we will be doing July 16th to 18th on religious freedom. The last year's one was a groundbreaking, first ever foreign ministers ministerial on the topic of religious freedom. We had 84 countries represented. This year we've invited 115, and we have over 900 registrants in the civil society portion of it, which will close registration on that on Friday because we're concerned we just don't have space. There will be a second stage the Religious Freedom Roundtable is hosting that will take place during the week. So we'll have places for everybody, but this will be the world gathering on religious freedom, and I want to invite everybody here. Members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to discuss the state of religious freedom around the world with particular focus on Christians globally. The deprivation of this fundamental human right is unconscionable. But this administration continues to prove that we will not stand by idly and watch the increased violence towards practitioners of all faiths continue. Just last week, released our annual International Religious Freedom Report. These reports really are the go-to guides, or as Secretary Pompeo called them, the report cards, chronicling religious freedom abuses, discrimination, persecution in almost 200 countries and territories. These reports include narratives and hard data to describe the attacks on people of all faith around the world, including Christians. According to the recent study by Pew that the chairman cited, Christians face the most widespread harassment of any religious group. They're targeted in 144 countries globally. Religious persecution is a defining challenge of the 21st century, and the United States will proudly lead the charge to protect religious freedom wherever it is under attack. Unfortunately, looking around the world, many places cry out for attention. Throughout the Middle East, Christian communities are dwindling due to harsh persecution, unjust imprisonments, and religiously motivated violence. In Iran, many languish in jail simply for exercising their fundamental freedom to worship, to observe, practice, and teach their faiths. Courts such as the notorious Tehran Revolutionary Court use charges of enmity against God, corruption on earth, and disturbing national security to target people who dissent from state-sanctioned policies and beliefs. In Nicaragua, religious leaders report constant surveillance, intimidation, and threats. The National Police assault priests in full daylight, revealing the government's contempt for any religious leader they view as a threat to their authority. At last year's pioneering ministerial to advance religious freedom, the State Department hosted 2 Catholic priests whose parishes came under gunfire, highlighting their courage in the face of aggression. And finally, I turn to China. In addition to its well-documented repression on Muslims in Xinjiang, Buddhists in Tibet, and Falun Gong practitioners throughout the country, the government has recently accelerated efforts to repress Christians. Last year, mainland China began enforcing amended regulations for religious affairs. These regulations give the government more power to control where people worship, with whom they worship, and the content of their worship. Since those regulations came into force, the crackdown on Christianity has increased dramatically. Through all of our efforts, we are chasing a simple but important dream: that one day all peoples around the world will be able to exercise their fundamental freedoms, including the right to religious freedom, allowing individuals the liberty and dignity to do with their own soul as they wish. To those countries who deny their citizens this fundamental human right, the United States is watching and ready to take action. The war against faith is one no government can ever win. One of those efforts that will take place this next month is one I mentioned, when Secretary Pompeo will host the 2nd Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom. As civil society groups, religious leaders, and foreign governments come together, we will discuss both the nature of religious freedom as a fundamental freedom and the benefits that come with greater degrees of religious freedom, including less terrorism and greater economic growth. As we look around the world, there's much work to be done. I would note one of our partners that's really grown in their activity in this area has been the United Arab Emirates. And the reason I want to mention this is they did a groundbreaking activity this year when they hosted the first ever papal visit on the Arabian Peninsula ever in the history of mankind. And you can look, here is a dynamic, growing area that has a diverse religious atmosphere, and it's growing. And that's part of what we're telling many of these countries, that this religious freedom is not only a fundamental right, it helps your economy grow and it reduces terrorism. This has good things that happen on many regards. And so we're going to continue to push that message. That'll be part of the message in the ministerial, is this is a fundamental right, but it also carries an abundant set of good things that happen to your country when you engage it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Let me ask you, if I could, first of all, on your ministerial to advance religious freedom, what a strategic gathering of people, but it takes leadership to do it, and I want to thank you for that leadership, and Secretary of State Pompeo and the Vice President, of course, who has been outspoken in his support of international religious freedom. Maybe you might want to speak to some of the goals and hopes that you will have. As you pointed out in your testimony a moment ago, the response has been so robust that you may have to, restrict any further people from coming just because there's a lack of capacity. I think that's an incredible testimony to the first one, which you had last year, and a growing interest among, strategic people in other countries and NGOs that can make a difference. So if you might want to speak to that.
Well, thank you. And we're excited about it. Secretary is excited about it. What we really hope to do out of this is to launch a grassroots movement globally. The real need in this area is to happen in this area what's happened in the human trafficking field, which is something I've mentioned to you. The human trafficking cause, which you and others have taken on.
And you.
I did as well. But what it spawned was then this grassroots movement. So I remember when I first went out about this, people would say, what are you talking about on human trafficking? And you'd have to explain it to people. Well, now there's no explaining it to people, and people everywhere are taking up individual causes, and various groups are pushing it. We want to spawn the same grassroots movement on religious freedom. We want to see countries in their own country and the people of faith in that country bind together and stand for each other's religious freedom. We're starting religious freedom roundtables in a number of different countries. We have one here, and we've got 6 started in various countries, where people of faith, or no faith at all in those countries, would come together and stand for each other's religious freedom. And we hope out of this ministerial that we really spawn and fan the flames of getting more and more of this grassroots movement for religious freedom going forward around the world. We'll have speakers from around the world. We'll have participants from around the world at it. But this really needs to take off, and it's my sense and my feeling, it really is, that people are starting to see this is a fundamental right that I have and that I'm not able to practice, because most people are persecuted or live in some sort of restricted environment. The other thing I hope, Mr. Chairman, that we can do is that somewhere along the way here we can start getting like-minded countries to agree and start establishing a bare minimum set of standards for religious freedom. That religious freedom includes not locking up religious minorities, that it includes protecting all religious minorities that peacefully practice, that some like-minded governments will start to establish some of what those bare minimums are, so that the world community can see, well, this is what you're talking about, and then we ratchet up over time, increase those standards, and improve them. But I really think that's something we need to start working on.
Let me, with regards to China, if you would speak to, obviously they're a CPC country. They've been since the very inception of the first report after enactment of the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. They have not gotten better. They've gotten demonstrably worse. And under Xi Jinping, as I said in my opening, this whole idea of synodization, I think, is one of the most, it's an existential threat to faith, of all faiths, including Christians in China. And your thoughts on that? And, Tom Farr, who is a brilliant leader, as we all know, in the area of religious freedom, worked at the USCIRF office, ran it for a while, has done a tremendous job. He's one of our witnesses today. Points out in his testimony that there has been a failure in our Justice Department side in telling judges the true nature of what's going on with regards to religious freedom. And he points out there's a case in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit that said that a Chinese Christian, lacked a well-founded fear of persecution when that person certainly had. It was overturned at the next level. But I think, if our judges are not adequately apprised, and your report certainly makes it clear just how bad it is, but whether or not that crosses over to another branch of government, i.e. the Justice Department, there could be very bad advice going out to those courts, especially to those judges. So perhaps you could speak to the synodization. I've been in Congress since 1981. I've worked on human rights in China since 1981. And has 68 hearings I've chaired, done amendments, bills, resolutions. It's never been worse than it is right now. And I know the president's taking a very hard line on trade, and I think that's appreciated by so many of us. But maybe if you would speak to Xi Jinping's synodization campaign, because it's, like I said, I believe an existential threat to all faiths.
I think everybody's hopeful for the weekend meeting between the president and Xi Jinping, and I know there'd be a lot of people, and there are a lot of people praying for that meeting, that it would go well and that there'd be some breakthroughs. There has been and there is deep concern, and it's noted in our report. You'll note in the report this year we do a special section on Xinjiang, because it's just, there's been so much interest and focus, and there's so much, unfortunately, that's going on there that's deeply troubling. I've spoken about it often. The synodization, I'm like you, that's not a common word, and it's also something that's just terribly troubling, that you would take a faith and you would try to fit it for your country and your country's government. Faiths don't fit in government boxes. Faiths are of their own, and they have their own set of rules. And when a government tries to control faith, is when they're headed for trouble. And many governments before have tried to do things like this, and it hasn't worked, and it won't work. These are different in the Christian thinking. These are different kingdoms. There's the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man. And these are just in different spaces. So I'm troubled about this, and I also would just clearly state I do not believe this will work. This will not work.
Before yielding to my good friend, Mr. Bilirakis, just a couple of other very brief questions. Obviously, you were very much a part of the effort to ensure that the Chaldean Christians and others who were the victims of genocide got not just as much protection as we could provide, and of course, eviscerating ISIS is a key to that, but also humanitarian aid, and the Vice President, I think, has done, and you, a very good job. We did get a bill passed that was signed into law to do just that as well, to strengthen those efforts. Perhaps you could speak to what your sense is regarding Christians in the Middle East in general, and of course, Christians that are suffering as a result of the war in Syria and ongoing problems in Iraq. I would note parenthetically that Pope Tawadros was in my district, the Coptic Christian Pope, as I know you know, and I heard him speak at 2 churches, and then I spoke with him at a big rally. He speaks very fondly, although there are some gaps still, but President el-Sisi certainly has taken on the cause of protecting Coptic Christians in Egypt, unlike his predecessor, Morsi. So maybe you could speak to that as well. But and then finally, I do have a lot of questions, but we have 3 panels, so I don't want to, and I know you have a busy schedule. On the CPC side, Saudi Arabia obviously continues to be an ongoing egregious violator of Christian and other faiths. Parenthetically, the priest that married my wife and I in 1977 was the chaplain for Operation Desert Storm, and he was there in Saudi Arabia. There we are, our troops deployed to protect from Saddam Hussein any further, after Kuwait, any further attack into Saudi Arabia, and he couldn't celebrate Mass, certainly couldn't do it openly, and had to call it other things. And the Matawa, as we all know, the religious police, beat people, especially the Filipinos and others who happen to be predominantly Christian. So, I remember John Hanford saying about both Vietnam and Saudi Arabia, your predecessor as ambassador, that there were deliverables that we thought we might get pursuant to Frank Wolf's landmark law, the International Religious Freedom Act, and they just haven't materialized. So maybe you could speak to, is it time for Vietnam to go on CPC? And if that's something under consideration that you don't want to reveal yet, but I hope you would do it. And of course, what can we do further with Saudi Arabia?
You hit probably the worst area of the world for what Christians are suffering would be in the Middle East. Frank Wolf has spoken eloquently about this, but also the data points that the just drop in the number of Christians. There was a recent British report that was out calling it was a horrific situation, and their terminology was near genocide in this British report, which we hope to have presented at the ministerial. I think the situation is stabilized in northern Iraq. I've been there last year. There's been a lot of resources going into rebuilding both the Yazidi and Christian area in northern Iraq. But the security situation is still volatile and I think keeps a number of people from moving back. The longer that goes on, the more likely it is that people will just give up and leave and move out of the region, as has happened so much in much of the Middle East. I agree with you on President Sisi doing work in Egypt to try to protect the religious minorities. There's still a great deal of communal violence, as you'll note in our report, towards Christians in Egypt. Saudi Arabia continues to be a country of particular concern. As you know, the report is issued, and then there's a period of time for review of that, and then determinations on announcing the next set of CPC or special watch list countries. I appreciate the opportunity now with the statutory authority to have special watch lists, because it's given us an additional tool to warn countries that there are ones that we are looking at and considering putting on the CPC list. I think when the new Crown Prince came into Saudi Arabia, that a lot of people were very hopeful. The language changed, the desires, the stated objectives were moving in a different direction, and then a number of people have been deeply disappointed and concerned about what's happened. We're hopeful that things were going to change. We continue to work with other countries in the Arabian Peninsula and work closely with them to try to move the situation forward. We continued to talk with them about saying, look, this isn't just about our view of religious freedom. This is about your economic growth and diversification opportunities. This is about being anti-terrorism. So we will continue to have those conversations. We had a groundbreaking regional summit in UAE this year on textbooks, which has been a long-term problem that we've pushed, saying don't denigrate your religious minorities. And we would push on people and we'd get a little aware, and then a lot of times they would fall back. Well, the UAE took this cause up and hosted their regional summit on textbooks and getting textbook material not to denigrate religious minorities. So we're glad to have other players now coming onto the field to help out, and these are steps, and I think they're important ones.
No other questions, but out of the interest of my colleagues, I yield to Ms. Omar of Minnesota, who's a member of the commission.
Thank you. Mr. Smith, I want to thank you and Mr. McGovern for having this very important hearing today. I truly believe that protecting the rights and freedoms of any minorities means protecting the rights and freedoms of all. It's never the case that only one religious minority gets persecuted. When we see it against one religious minority, we always see it against others as well. To me, the fight against persecution of Christians around the world is the same fight as the fight against persecution for Muslims or Jewish people or any other minority religions. We must oppose religious bigotry in all of its forms. I know that my colleague, Mr. Smith, agrees with me, and he has been one of the most vocal advocates for the Uyghur Muslims in China. I'm proud to co-sponsor the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, and I'm grateful for his leadership on this issue. I look forward to working together and getting this bill passed through the Foreign Affairs Committee, where we both serve, and then get it passed through the House. And I look forward to discussing the role that the Commission and Congress can play in advancing the rights of Christians where they are persecuted. I also hope that this is the first series of hearings on the violation of religious freedom. The right to worship freely and openly is fundamental. Government should not impose religion on people. This is why I introduced the Brunei Human Rights Act to authorize the global Magnitsky sanctions on Brunei and other countries that have penal codes that disproportionately target vulnerable populations, including religious minorities. I invite my colleagues on the Commission to join myself and Mr. McGovern as co-sponsors. Ambassador Brownback, I am very excited to have you here today. I've admired the way that you've conducted your work in your current position. And I sincerely appreciate your work on the Uyghurs in China and the Rohingya in Burma. The timing is perfect because last week I led a bipartisan letter to your office with Mr. McGovern and Mr. Bill Johnson on the situation in Sri Lanka. So this gives me a chance to ask you some of the questions that we sent you in the letter directly. Since the horrific attacks on Easter Sunday, we've seen some very worrying signs of religious minorities in Sri Lanka. Our letter talked about the persecution of Muslims, but on topic for today's hearing, we also talked about the persecution of Catholics. I'm hearing from people on the ground that Catholics in Sri Lanka are worried that the government is using the excuse of security to shut down churches and cathedrals. In the wake of the bombing, Catholics are being prohibited from gathering for Mass Sunday, supposedly for their own protection. Some of those churches are being guarded by some military that have tortured Catholics during the Civil War not too long ago. Many of them are understandably nervous about the Sri Lanka government's intentions. So I wanted to talk to you about some of the conversations that you've been having with the government and the way that they've been responding to this attack. Have the rights of the religious minorities in Sri Lanka been in the forefronts of the discussions you've been having with them?
Thanks for the questions and thanks for the interest, and yes, it has. I've met with the ambassador, I've met with the foreign secretary of Sri Lanka, we made calls into there. The State Department has been aggressive and on top of addressing the situation. It was horrific, absolutely horrific what took place, and deep concerns about then what follows on that, what the reaction of the government in Sri Lanka would be. I've been to Sri Lanka years ago. I've worked with the people there. It's a complex environment for as far as a number of multiple entities and players and conflicts and ethnicities and religions, all of pretty substantial size. Excuse me. So we've been pushing the Sri Lankan government to protect the rights of the religious minorities and allow them to practice their faith, at the same time recognizing there's legitimate security concerns and deep wounds within the society that need to be addressed. There needs to be some major reconciliation. We need really religious leaders to come together and stand up for each other's rights to practice their faith. These are things we're trying to start around the world, these religious freedom roundtables, where we'll get the religious leaders of all various faiths and no faith at all to stand up for each other's right to practice their faith freely. So we're going to continue to work with them. We'll invite activists to the ministerial. Matter of fact, there are civil society activists from Sri Lanka that have been invited to our ministerial here this next month, and we're going to continue to focus on it. I have the letter here that you've sent. I agree with it, and we're going to continue to press along those lines.
Okay. Do you see any promising signs that religious communities are coming together? I know here in the United States, anytime a religious minority is attacked, many of us come together to fight against the bigotry, and I just wanted to know if that's what you're seeing in Sri Lanka.
You're seeing some. The Catholic cardinal there has done an outstanding job of talking about no retribution, no response for as far as on a violence basis, and others have stood up. It's a tough atmosphere, and it's a difficult setting with a lot of history to it. But to date, there hasn't been this huge overreaction that people are concerned about or actions taken, but there have been some that have happened. But we're going to keep working on it, and to date, it's been, the worst case scenarios have certainly not developed, and some moderating forces and people have come together, and there have been overall some improvements taking place. I think, though, it measures and it needs our continued focus. One thing I would note for you, that there was a fund created at last year's ministerial to help the victims of religious violence, and that fund has been offered to Sri Lanka, and I don't know the amount that's been used out of it, but that was a tangible thing that's been offered and used by or offered by the United States from last year's ministerial to Sri Lanka.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. I feel better knowing that we are a part of this conversation and that we're going to make sure that the rights of religious minorities aren't eroded even as we deal with the threats of terrorism. So
Yes.
appreciate you.
I'd like to yield to Mr. Bilirakis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for really putting a spotlight on religious freedom around the world, and appreciate you taking this position as well. Well, first question is, which countries have you seen since you've been in this position that have made advancements, progress, action, not just words, with regard to religious freedom, building churches, being able to express your religious beliefs publicly? Which countries would you say have made a great deal of progress or some progress?
One of the examples that we've worked with very closely has been Uzbekistan. They let 13,000 political and religious prisoners out of jail. They started letting minority children of underage children go to mosque. They weren't previously. They've registered some more churches, now not enough or as many as have asked to be registered. And they've got a religious freedom law that they are considering now. And I've met with the leadership multiple times. We're offering particular things that we would work with them because we want them to be a model throughout Central Asia for how do you move off of this sort of police state atmosphere and into a more normalized atmosphere for religious freedom. And now we're starting to talk with some other countries in that region now that they can see, okay, here's a country that's done it, things haven't fallen apart, and so now we're starting to talk with some other countries in that region. So that one's been very helpful and promising. We had a situation, and I'm not going to name the country because I think it actually might be detrimental, but they arrested 21 Seventh-day Adventists on a Tuesday. It came to our attention and other people's. We contacted them about that, and by Friday they'd released them because they didn't want the international notoriety of having arrested a bunch of people of faith. I'm counting that a win, that the international focus has been helpful to push that forward. I gave you the example of the UAE, who's in a year of tolerance now and hosted a papal visit, is opening up churches, Hindu temples for all. And what they're saying and seeing is, look, we're a small country with a lot of expats here. If we want to attract people, we've got to have an open religious atmosphere, and they're creating it. And it doesn't mean they lose their faith of their citizens. It's working greatly for them economically. Those are some examples that are at the top of my mind. I'd also give you one other example, because at times I get kind of despairing that we're not making more progress, because this seems so fundamental to me, that why wouldn't everybody just embrace it? And I was given those comments in Nashville, and a Baha'i man came up to me afterwards, and he said, you know, I want to encourage you on this, in the sense that in Iran, they know exactly where all the Baha'is are. And if it wasn't for the international community pushing back, they would have rounded all of them up, and he said they would have killed them already. This was his statement. I'm not saying that's what would have happened. That was his statement. But because of the international pressure, they haven't done it. Now, Baha'is don't get to participate in the country. They don't get the same education. They can often get locked up and different things happen. But they're not all in jail, and they've not all been killed. And he said, I think you ought to consider that part of the success, is that countries don't do things that they would probably do because they're concerned about the spotlight. And that spotlight, if it wasn't for the United States, wouldn't be there. This is the place that's pushing it more than anybody else around the world.
And I really appreciate your work too, because we've got a long way to go, but we've made some progress. Sir, on Nigeria, we had a mother of a 14-year-old girl visit me a couple weeks ago. You may be familiar with this, and they asked her. The government asked her what her affiliation, her religious affiliation was, and she said she was Christian. And then they detained her. This was roughly 2 years ago. Her family has not seen. She spent her 15th birthday in a prison, and her family has not seen her for 2 years. They don't even know where she is. And I've committed, and more than likely they've visited Representative Smith as well, but I've committed to do everything I possibly can to get her back to her family. But in general, in Nigeria, and hopefully you can work with me on that, but in general, would you define Nigeria, is there, in your opinion, genocide taking place in Nigeria?
Well, as you know, genocide is a specific legal definition that the Secretary is empowered to declare, and that's his call of what to do. We've done our report this year. We did a thorough report on Nigeria. It is, and it's the country I've spent the most actual time in, was in Nigeria, because the conflict is there and it's deadly. And you're getting, a lot of people are getting killed in Nigeria. I believe the Vice President of Nigeria is in the United States now. He's been in New York, and I think he's going to be coming here. I've met with him previously. We've pressed the Nigerians a lot about this, and there just has to be more done by that government. They need to protect their religious minorities. They need to protect their religious majority and minorities. There's a lot of effort, I think, by the terroristic community globally to really engage and to press forward in Nigeria. I met with the lady that you're talking about, I believe, and we will update you what we've got going on her specific account. But I think Nigeria is one we've really got to continue to press the government to take action to protect its protect its people, protect its religious community, and to prosecute those that violate the laws. What I hear about a lot from Nigerians as well is that things will happen, and then there's no somebody will be killed, a village will be raided, a number of people killed, but then there's no justice after, there's no investigation that takes place. Well, this is basics for a government to do, and this has to start taking place more aggressively in Nigeria.
Thank you. One last question, Mr. Chair. Is that fine? Okay. I appreciate you meeting with the Greek Orthodox, the new Greek Orthodox Archbishop. I believe you were the first one to greet him here in New York officially, and I appreciate that so very much. He's a wonderful person, as you know, yes. Very well respected throughout the world. His name is Elpidophoros. Translate that into English, means hope. Hope for all Christians and all religious minorities. And I met him for the first time at Halki, the seminary in Halki. And as you know, the seminary has been closed. He was the abbot prior to this position, taking this position in the United States. But as you know, the seminary has been closed since 1971. For no reason. And this is where the Greek Orthodox Christians, but Orthodox Christians in general throughout the world, because when I was there, I saw many, many priests who were not Greek, but Orthodox throughout the world, just representing different countries. But the place has been, it's a beautiful location, and I'd like to go with you one day and show you around. It's a beautiful place, but it has been closed since 1971, and it's very difficult to train, as you know, priests, hierarchs, future archbishops, patriarchs, without a school. It even has a high school with a principal, but no students are allowed. So can you give me a progress report? I know that Secretary Pompeo stated just the other day, and I appreciate that. I've been communicating with him as well, that we are for opening up that school at Halki, that seminary, and very emphatically he stated that. So if you could give me a progress report on that, I would really appreciate it.
I had a great visit with the new Archbishop, delightful gentleman, delighted to have him in that role. I recently did a trip to the Orthodox region of the world and spent it 2 days and a night on Mount Athos.
Oh, wow.
Which was, I would recommend to you. It's, there's no place in the world like it.
Yeah, and I understand the secretary, HHS Secretary Azar, wants to go. Yeah, I'm gonna go. My son has been there, but I haven't had an opportunity yet.
It's amazing. I did that as a direction from the Secretary to reach out to work more with the Orthodox world. It's 800 million adherents globally in a region that Russia is seeking to dominate culturally, and there's no reason we shouldn't be reaching out and working more with it. And so we're developing efforts to do that, I had excellent meetings there. Went to Greece, Mount Athos, Moldova, Romania, Bulgaria, and had excellent meetings with individuals. I look forward to it. Halki came up. Certainly my meetings in Mount Athos, Halki came up that this needs to be reopened. It's been, as you note, closed for a long time. It's been an effort to reopen it, but it hasn't been successful. And this administration would really like to see that change, so that seminary opens, so that they can train, as you note, people for the ecumenical patriarchate that's there in Istanbul. That needs to take place. So we were meeting. Part of my meeting, a good part of my meeting with the new Archbishop, was to discuss what we can do to really press the Turkish government to open this up. That's the only thing that's impeding it, is the Turkish government is blocking it being reopened, and they should allow it. They have historically allowed it. There is no reason it shouldn't be open now. And we'll be pressing the Turkish government to do that. And hopefully they will see the wisdom and the need and the value to them to have this opened up. And so that's certainly in the discussions and what we can do to work with the Turkish government for them to be able to see this as a win-win on their side, too, to have Halki reopened.
Absolutely. Thank you. I yield back. Thank you again, Mr. Ambassador.
Sure.
I'd like to yield to the distinguished gentleman from Ohio, Steve Shabbat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for your leadership on this topic and so many other topics when it comes to human rights and religious freedom. We appreciate your leadership very much, Mr. Smith. You've done a tremendous job. I also want to thank Sam Brownback, who we go back a ways.
We do.
We were part of the historic class in '94. There were 73 Republicans elected that year and 12 Democrats. Some of us went off to bigger and better things, became senators and governors and ambassadors and all kinds of stuff. Out of the 73 Republicans, there are two of us left in the House.
I wondered how many were left.
Mac Thornberry and myself, the only two left. There were 12 Democrats, and there are 4 of them left. So now they outnumber us 2-1. So it's kind of amazing. But in any event, on the topic at hand, and thank you again for your leadership on this, Chris. But Sam, just to go back a little bit, when we went into Iraq, obviously very controversial. We could debate whether we should or shouldn't have forever. The bottom line is we did, and ultimately, with a lot of missteps and a lot of blood and treasure expended, we ultimately had a fairly stable condition there, and then the previous administration decided against the recommendations of virtually everybody that I talked to, and I'd been to Iraq 3 times over those years. He decided to pull virtually everybody out and let the Iraqi government do what happened. Iran came in with a lot more influence than was, I think, healthy in the region. And most unfortunately, most horrifically, we saw the rise of ISIS and the impact that they had on both Christians and Muslims who were not ISIS connected, and just all kinds of horrific things happened. And so my question to you is twofold. If you can, I apologize if you've already covered this prior to, in this hearing. I was down at the Justice Department. I'm also on the Judiciary Committee reviewing a whole bunch of documents for an hour and a half till I got here. That's why I was a little bit late. But relative to the conditions that Christians in particular suffered at the hands of ISIS, if you could just relate again what that was, and now that ISIS has been defeated, what threat is there still to both Christians and non-Christians, to those ISIS elements who are still in the region or have gone out into other areas? How much of a threat is that philosophy that they espouse?
Thanks, Congressman, and it's good to see you. Always appreciate your heart and what you did and how you've served served well and served as a gentleman, which I say is a high compliment. It's far better in northern Iraq right now for the minorities, particularly the Yazidis and Christians. It still lacks true security in the area. When I was there last year, I went with the AID director and several other people. Vice President's office was there. They've done a lot of effort to rebuild it. We've put $300 million into rebuilding it in an innovative way. Instead of going through UN programs, we've gone through really local entities, and it's been much more effective. It's harder to do. It's harder to authenticate. It's harder to track the money. But at the end, you're getting more bang for your buck, and I hope will be a different model that we'll start doing aid. At our ministerial, we're going to have, in July, we're going to have a whole day track of AID working with, and how to work with religious minorities, because we really want to see more of these funds go through local entities that we think can be more effective. And they have been in this area. And you can go in and you can see where some of the money has gone. You also see other governments have gone in there. The Hungarians and the Poles have gone in and working with local entities in a very, I think, new and effective way. And we're trying to get more governments to do things like that. That was part of my Orthodox trip, was actually reaching out to government and entities about how could you work through these local ones. The security situation is still tenuous. Would be the word I would use to describe it. It's just, it's there. They're secure right now. But if something comes up, another ISIS 3.0 or whatever the next iteration is, it's going to need outside support to be there, or else I think you could see another expansion taking place, and that then makes for timidity on people moving back. You've had about, last I checked, now this is probably 2 months ago, about 60% of the population had moved back into some of these religious minorities regions, which was excellent, I thought, for relative what we've seen in the past. Normally, they get hit, they just leave, and they immigrate to Europe, the United States, and they're gone. So people have moved back, but the security situation is still not effectively long-term dealt with, and that's preventing the long-term growth from, I think, really taking hold.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and in the interest of time, I know we have votes coming up relatively soon. I'll yield back. Thank you.
Steve, thank you very much. And thank you for your leadership on human rights all these years as well. It's been extraordinary. Ms. Omar would like to ask another question, and I would, before going and yielding to my distinguished colleague, just encourage you to take a look at Erdogan's very, very, in my opinion, deplorable abuse of the Orthodox, both in Cyprus and, of course, in Turkey itself. And I know you're on that, so please, I do think they should be named CPC, and I do hope that Vietnam would be looked at again. They were taken off when the bilateral agreement occurred, as you know, with the thought, the expectation, and the promise that there would be deliverables when it came to religious freedom. I went over and spent about a week in Hue, Ho Chi Minh City, and Hanoi, and met with about 60 pastors, members of the Unified Buddhist Church, Thich Quang Ngo, all these, he was under pagoda arrest at the time. And while they all had some hope, all of that was dashed as the Vietnamese government went right back and even doubled down in terms of their repression. So I would sincerely request, as you're looking at Vietnam, that they be put on the CPC listing. Ms. Omar.
We did, if I could just quickly on Vietnam, I've sent people back over to Vietnam. I've met with officials there and told them, look, if you continue to trend this direction, this is not going to bode well. And so we've had and continue to have pretty high-level discussions with the Vietnamese. They seem to really, Congressman, just really try to want to be right on the line of getting to CPC, but not there. It's just like they're trying to titrate this to, we want to do everything wrong we can, but just not get on CPC. Right. And
Well, I do think, with respect, that when sanctions, first the designation and the imposition of at least some of those 18 sanctions prescribed in the Act, it will make a difference. You know, I work a lot of international child abduction, parental child abduction, and that too prescribes a number of sanctions. Well, Congressman Posey of Florida has at least 2 constituents that have had abducted children to Lebanon. He went forward with an amendment to cut some of that funding. All of a sudden, voila, those children have been reunited with the left behind parents. So I think it worked with Brazil with the potential of losing GSP. So I do think judiciously applied and consistently applied sanctions can have the very noble and notable effect of effectuating a human rights positive. So, Ms. Omar, and we do have some votes, and then we're going to have to briefly.
Ambassador, my question is really quick. The country of Central African Republic, has had for the last 5 years extreme violence against Muslims in that country, which has led to about 80% of them fleeing to neighboring countries. And I'm wondering if that's been in your radar and what we have been doing to help out the Muslims in that country.
It has been on my radar. I've met with CAR officials. My predecessor traveled there. I had a staff member there. This has probably been 6-7 months ago in CAR. We've got another idea we're trying to work with on CAR. But part of the problem in CAR is there's just a limited amount of government reach outside of the capital city. They've just not got. They don't appear to have a lot of government control or reach in the country, and so you've got a big country there that you've just got a limited reach. That's no excuse, and it may be merits that we need to be doing more. There is a lot of violence that's taking place. There's another program which I can't announce at this point that we're going to be talking with CAR about being engaged with. And so we hope to be engaged there in a productive fashion. There are limitations on what the government can seem to get done and to reach to. I don't want to give them an excuse. I'm noting what the situation is.
Yeah, 80% displacement of a religious minority is very alarming, and I look forward to working with you and trying to figure out what are other things that we can do to help. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Let me just, we're going to have to take a brief pause. There's a couple of votes on the floor. And I apologize to our 3 remaining witnesses for that delay, but we will come right back as soon as they are over. I would ask unanimous consent that 2 testimonies be submitted to the record. Without objection, it is so ordered. And I would also say that my distinguished co-chair has not been here for this first part of the hearing, Mr. Ambassador. He's been managing the rule that's on the floor, but he sends his best, and without objection, his full statement will be made a part of the record as well. We stand in a brief pause before resuming with the USCIRF Vice Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your testimony and above all for your leadership. Stand in recess. The commission will resume its sitting, and it is my distinct privilege and honor to welcome our next witness, Nadine Mainza, who has served as chairwoman of the Hardwired Global, an organization working to stop religious oppression around the world. She's advised the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the College Board, the Annie Casey Foundation, and most important now, we believe, is that she's vice chair of USCIRF, and thank you for your leadership there. She also had worked for Senator John Hines and later Rick Santorum. Again, you're more than welcome. Please proceed however you'd like. Your full statement will be made a part of the record, but the floor is yours.
There we go. Thank you so much, Co-Chair Smith, and also to the rest of the commission for inviting me to be a part of this hearing today. On behalf of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, also known as USCIRF. USCIRF is an independent, bipartisan U.S. federal government body that is dedicated to promoting the universal right of freedom of religion or belief around the world. USCIRF is led by 9 commissioners who are appointed by the White House and the leadership of both chambers of Congress from both parties, supported by a nonpartisan professional staff of 20. USCIRF seeks to defend international religious freedom for people of all faiths, including Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, Christians, Hindus, Baha'is, Falun Gong, and many more, including those that have no faith at all. Throughout the year, we monitor religious freedom conditions abroad and make policy recommendations to the President, Department of State, and Congress. In order to closely evaluate often fluid religious freedom situations on the ground, USCIRF commissioners and staff frequently travel to meet directly with marginalized religious communities, victims of persecution, and even with governments responsible for perpetrating those abuses. In 2018 and 2019, USCIRF traveled to 13 countries to examine religious freedom conditions. Our research focuses on those governments and non-state actors who are the worst violators of religious freedom, and it is published each year in our annual report, along with specific and actionable policy recommendations for the U.S. government. Our most recent annual report was released less than 2 months ago and covers 28 countries. I'd like to highlight some key opportunities for policy action in 3 countries with very pressing situations regarding persecuted Christian populations. First, Pakistan is a country where both the government and non-state actors have long committed egregious abuses against Christians. Over the past year, state security forces have disappeared dozens of young Christian men in Karachi. While many have been released, there is widespread fear in the community that the government will escalate these arbitrary arrests. Forced conversion of young Christian and Hindu women into Islam, often through bonded labor, remains a systemic problem. Many are kidnapped, forcibly married, and raped. Religious minorities lack legal protection, and when such cases are investigated, the young woman is often publicly questioned in front of the man she was forced to marry, which then puts pressure on her to deny there was ever any coercion. In 2018, the country's strict blasphemy laws and increased extremist activity further threaten these already marginalized Christian communities. This past November, the State Department followed USCIRF's longstanding recommendation by designating for the first time Pakistan as a country of particular concern, or a CPC, under the International Religious Freedom Act. Although the department immediately issued a waiver on imposing any punitive measures. We recommend that the State Department redesignate Pakistan as a CPC again this year, lift the waiver, and enter into a binding agreement with the government to encourage a roadmap with clear benchmarks to address these violations. We would also like to see the department assign a portion of existing State Department programs to help the government protect at-risk religious minority community members. A current trend in religious freedom violations is for the government to suppress and persecute faith communities under the guise of protecting public order or national security, frequently invoking real or perceived threats to the nation. Eritrea has long used the specter of war with Ethiopia and the fear of foreign influence as an explanation for forced conscription into the military and mass persecution. Human rights watchers hope that last year's peace deal with Ethiopia and the resolution of their border dispute would improve conditions for marginalized populations in Eritrea, but that has not been the case. All faith communities in Eritrea must register with the government, but only 4 communities are approved as legal: the Eritrean Orthodox Church, Sunni Islam, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Evangelical Church of Eritrea. Christian-affiliated groups such as the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, Seventh-day Adventists, Pentecostals, and other evangelical denominations, and Jehovah's Witnesses are vigorously and systematically suppressed. They are prohibited from building or owning houses of worship or engaging in religious practices such as praying in groups. Security forces continue to arrest members of this group. Many Christians have been detained for more than 13 years, denied medical treatment, and at times held in crowded metal shipping containers. When Christians are released, they are often forced to sign promises they will no longer attend meetings or worship services at their own churches. Even those within the 4 approved faith groups are not safe from persecution. Earlier this month, the Eritrean government seized and shut down Catholic church-run health facilities across the country in apparent retaliation against Catholic bishops who had made a bold call for national reconciliation. Given the recent political developments in Eritrea, and for the first time in 20 years, Congress has a unique window of opportunity to address these abuses. USCIRF encourages you, as co-chairs of this commission, to increase your engagement with the Department of State on Eritrea and to tie any further U.S. and international involvement with Eritrea to religious freedom benchmarks. A congressional delegation recently traveled to Eritrea, and with your leadership in Congress, USCIRF believes there is sufficient support to see real change in this country. And lastly, I would like to close by talking about Burma. I concluded a trip to the country just 3 weeks ago where I met with multiple individuals and groups suffering under religious persecution. The international community has sought to respond to the horrific abuses leveled against the Rohingya population, but less known is the plight of Christians. Over the last several years, intensified fighting between Burma's military and the ethnic armed organizations in parts of Kachin and northern Shan states deeply impacted Christians by displacing thousands, which was in addition to the 100,000 people who have been internally displaced in these regions since 2011. Within this context, the military often blocks humanitarian assistance and has targeted houses of worship and religious leaders, accusing them of working with ethnic armed organizations. USCIRF has received information that in recent years, more than 30 churches were destroyed in Kachin State, pastors and parishioners have been physically assaulted in Rakhine State, and Christians in Chin State remain displaced and face ongoing harassment to convert to Buddhism. The Burmese government has created a culture of fear and violence for Christians that fundamentally undermines their ability to practice their faith. Many of these abuses have occurred at the hands of the Burmese military under the direction of Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. USCIRF calls on the U.S. government to sanction him for his direct role in perpetrating atrocities against Rohingya and ethnic minorities in Burma, including Christian and Rohingya Muslims. I realize that I have painted a rather bleak picture for you today, but those of us who are able must be willing to face these ugly situations and stand in solidarity with those who suffer because of their beliefs around the world. Persecuted Christians and others persecuted on the basis of their faith or beliefs, or ordinary people who are subject to unthinkable horrors. We must remind the persecuted that the world has not forgotten them, and we must create a broad coalition to implement effective policies that work on their behalf and hold accountable those who are responsible. USCIRF is proud that the U.S. government has long been at the forefront of efforts to counter this scourge, and we commend the Trump administration for their high priority and its place on this issue. We look forward to participating this summer at the Second Ministerial to address religious freedom and urge the Trump administration to appoint a special advisor on international religious freedom within the National Security Council and to further elevate its focus on religious freedom or belief abroad. Thank you again, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you so very much for your testimony, for the great work that the commission does. And as you know, when it was created in 1998, and I actually chaired the hearings on that. It was Frank Wolf's landmark legislation, and it was opposed by the Obama administration.
Wow.
The Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Labor, and Human Rights testified and said it would set up a hierarchy of human rights and that it was not a good idea. We just need to beef up the country reports on human rights practices every year on religion, and that would be enough, that it would be counterproductive. And the creation of the commission, it was Wolf's idea, was a tremendous idea.
It was.
As providing additional insight for the IRFA office at state. So, and you have done that so very, very well. This year's report, again, was on time, and I noticed you said that in your conveyance of it, May 1st, I believe it was, but on time as usual. So thank you for that. And your recommendations for CBC, I think that is so very important as a check. You know, state has a lot of other interests very often, and you know, Sam Brownback can weigh in as strongly as he possibly could, but then other undersecretaries, regional players at state then tend to push back. We see
Right.
that with trafficking as well. So
If anything, we support his voice by looking single as you said, single focus at only religious freedom. So
And
I
it
know
makes-
state has to look at all these other factors where we.
But I think all those
are
other
mandating-
factors are enhanced when
Yeah.
these individual human rights abuses are addressed with a very, very laser beam focus. So thank you for doing that. Did I say Obama? Yeah. Okay. It was the Clinton administration that very vigorously opposed it.
Right.
And I held the hearings right in this room, and
Well,
they
thank
came
you
out
for your
against it.
leadership for all.
No, I'm
the
not
years.
looking for that. I'm
Really
just saying,
appreciate that.
we've come a long way.
We sure have.
But USCIRF has done a tremendous job. You know, on Vietnam, it is one of the ones you recommended for CPC. I do hope that the department and the Secretary of State at long last says enough is enough. Was USCIRF individuals denied visas there?
We were not given visas
Not given,
on our trip. We weren't denied them, but they did not
But
submit
that-
them to
It's
us.
a distinction without a difference.
So we will try again, I
Right.
think in the fall again to go. We would like to go again. You know, as you know, we have recommended they be a CPC every year since 2002. And when the State Department did take them off the CPC in 2006, we felt it was too soon. We did not remove them from the CPC list. And we have found in 2018 that the overall situation has deteriorated. You know, the government crackdown on religious leaders, human rights defenders, peaceful activists continues. Over 244 political prisoners of conscience are jailed right now, and that this year, too, we saw the government seize property from Catholic churches, Buddhist temples, other religious organizations. So all sorts of rights were being violated pretty openly by the government themselves. So we do believe that they should have a CPC.
And, you know, even with the last administration, and Rabbi Saperstein, I think, did a very noble and effective job
Absolutely.
as Sam Brownback's predecessor. But when he tried to visit with a pastor in Vietnam, and you remember there was the person was beaten up. If that wasn't a trigger to say, if the ambassador at large for religious freedom seeks to make a contact, and then there's the bully boys of the secret police of Vietnam do a beatdown, that is just outrageous. And he was very, very upset about that, and yet still no CPC. So I hope it's time.
I believe so,
thank you
too.
for doing that. On Nigeria, my good friend Gus Bilirakis raised it. I've raised it. We've had numerous hearings on Nigeria. One of the things that we're all worried about is that there is a worsening of religious repression there. I remember on one trip I went to Jos, met with Archbishop Kegama, many of his churches were firebombed. But I also met with the imam and his fellow Muslim clerics who said they don't like Boko Haram.
Right.
That's not Islam. Islam is peaceful. This is not peaceful. Your thoughts on Nigeria, if you could?
Sure. We again recommend Nigeria as a CPC, even though the State Department has not made that designation. You know, we understand that so many of these abuses are from non-state actors in the state, but we believe the country itself is tolerating systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations by not intervening in all of these many one after another incidents against Christians and even, like you said, you've seen in the Muslim community, different religion communities. And so we do hope that the government would make them a CPC and then enter into a binding agreement with them to have some of these benchmarks for religious freedom.
Thank you. You know, I do have a lot of questions, and I will submit most of them for the record,
Okay.
just because we do have two
Right,
other
absolutely.
witnesses and more votes pending over
Okay.
on the House floor. But very briefly, if you could speak a little bit more on the Sinization of China
Yes.
by Xi Jinping. What is the trajectory of that egregious policy? Eritrea, I chaired a hearing in September of 2016 when we thought there might be some hope there, but maybe you could further elaborate there.
Sure.
And I think your point on Pakistan was so well taken, which is, CPC. But then the idea that the sanctions regime, any part of it is waived. Waiving of sanctions was always contemplated by Congress to be the exception, not the rule. And we often find with human rights law, including religious freedom, that there's a default to waiving and not doing the hard lift of saying, now there's going to be a penalty phase. And without that, countries don't take it seriously. So, and the more waivers meted out, the more it becomes routine. I think the more countries look at CPC designation as a paper tiger. So if you could speak to that.
Sure.
I would hope Pakistan no more waiver. It's time to get serious.
Absolutely. Pakistan's blasphemy laws are egregious. You know, the penalty for them is often death or life sentence. And we know that 40 people right now are on death row or life sentence because of it. And while the candidates during the election were using intolerant language and praising blasphemy laws going into the election, we've seen a little bit of the back away from it because they've seen the weaponization of these laws and the problems it's causing their country. We really feel like having them, the government step in and have there be consequences will encourage them to move away from things like the blasphemy laws. As you know, China, as you probably saw the front of our report, this year we focused on the Uyghur Muslims. So we are very concerned with China in all faith communities, frankly. There is none that have been untouched. We do believe that religious freedom should be raised as part of the trade negotiations that are going on. We also believe that there should be more sanctions against generals who are involved in these atrocities, including Chan Kuo, the Communist Party secretary in the Uyghur Autonomous Region. And we do hope that there will be more looking at businesses, American businesses that practice and sell technology to China. We believe there should be restrictions on exporting technology that is being used to persecute their own people. So we, as a commission, are very concerned about China, and we're glad that you are taking a look at that as well.
Thank you. One last thing, and again, I hope you'll get back with regards to the written questions.
Sure.
But Dr. David Curry makes it very clear that there's no other group of believers on the face of the earth that are more persecuted than Christians. Sam Brownback, Ambassador Brownback, started his comments with the Pew finding. Is that also USCIRF's belief?
You know, we have not taken a position on really ranking who's persecuted more than others because we
Every
really feel like,
persecution is
and our mandate is to look at all persecution and to be advocates equally for all faiths, and we're willing to speak out on behalf of all religions.
Thank you so very much for your
Thanks for
testimony.
having
and
me.
Really
Appreciate it.
appreciate it. All right, third in panel now, and I would welcome them to the witness table, beginning with Dr. David Curry, who's President and CEO of Open Doors USA. Dr. Curry, okay. No, it's not. And Dr. Thomas Farr will also be speaking today as a witness. Dr. Curry, I'm sorry I don't have your vitae, so maybe you could just do a little bit of that in your opening, if you wouldn't mind, because we really do appreciate what Open Doors USA does. I've been at many of your launches when you've announced just, again, what is truly happening in the world, and I thank you. We thank you so much for that. And Dr. Thomas Farr is president of the Religious Freedom Institute. He has served previously 28 years in the U.S. Army and U.S. Foreign Service. He became founding director of the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom. That's right after enactment of the IRFA legislation. He subsequently directed the Witherspoon Institute IRFA Task Force, was a member of the Chicago World Affairs Council's Task Force on Religion and Foreign Policy, taught at the National Defense University, and served on the Secretary of State's IRF working group. From 2007 to 2018, he was associate professor of the practice of religion and international affairs at Georgetown, a school of foreign service. He also directed Georgetown's Religious Freedom Project, the precursor of the Religious Freedom Institute. Dr. Farr is also a senior fellow at Baylor University's Institute for Studies of Religion and a consultant to the U.S. Catholic bishops. Without objection, even more on your resume will be made a part of the record. So if we could begin, Dr. Curry, with you, but please give a little bit of opening so that the commission will have that on the record.
Sure. Thank you very much, Chairman Smith. It's an honor to be here on behalf of Open Doors USA. I am the president and CEO. We have been supporting persecuted Christians around the world for over 64 years, starting with our founder, Brother Andrew, who I believe you have had the chance to meet many times and read his book. And so we're just grateful to be here.
God Smuggler.
That's right, God Smuggler.
Right.
This morning, I would like to request, of course, that my written testimony and the World Watch List be entered into the record.
Without objection to order.
Today, I'd like to tell you a little bit about this woman. Her name is Zana, and she lives in northern Nigeria. That has come up a lot here today. Zana is a widow because Boko Haram has attacked her village not once, not twice, but 4 times. And during one of those attacks, her husband was killed. Some militants forced their way into her home, and under the darkness, she was able to escape, but her husband was trapped in his home and burned alive because of their Christian faith. Unfortunately, Zana is not unique, being a widow, by these kinds of acts of violence in northern Nigeria. So what we're suggesting today is that there are a lot of people out there like her, and that more needs to be done for people like Zana. And even though it's horrific, it's not isolated. On the contrary, her story is emblematic of a far wider issue that impacts hundreds of millions of Christians, of men, women, and children around the world. For over 25 years, Open Doors has released the World Watch List documenting violations against Christians. Our data is only that which we can verify, so it's going to be a very conservative baseline. But nevertheless, there are 4,146 Christians that we can verify were killed for their faith last year. That's 11 Christians killed every day on average. Additionally, 2,625 Christians were detained without trial, arrested, sentenced, and imprisoned. Over 1,266 churches were attacked. And this data is carefully collected through networks established throughout more than 70 countries for over the past 6 decades, as I've said. It's often reported or verified directly by our in-country field offices who maintain regular contact with both survivors of religious persecution and the wider Christian community in the area. Sadly, the number of violent incidents against Christians documented last year represents a dramatic rise over the past recent years, and we believe it's attributed to the following factors. First, the spread of Islamic jihadist ideology. In Nigeria, Somalia, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere, theologies of hatred towards Christians and other religious minorities are widely propagated, leading to great suffering. Secondly, the rise of nationalist agendas in Asia. This year on the World Watch List, for the first time, India was number 10 on the watch list because of nationalist Hindu leaders stoking the idea that Muslims and Christians cannot truly be Indian because they are not Hindu. It's resulted in a shocking rise of attacks on Christian churches, with nearly 300 churches attacked thus far already in 2019, and hundreds of cases of pastors being held without trial just for being a Christian pastor, not for any other uncivil behavior. Lastly, the rise is based upon communist and post-communist systems. North Korea is the most oppressive place on earth to practice religious faith. Anything and anyone who challenges the Kim regime is considered an enemy of the state. Many are in prison for their faith, even for just possessing a Bible. With over 100 million Christians, China is also, as a communist country, has the the technology and political will to monitor and to restrict expression of faith like never before, as has been addressed with some of the previous witnesses. While Open Doors is working tirelessly to bring relief to those who suffer from severe religious violations, more must be done to address the underlying factors, and we are going to make a couple of recommendations here today. First, we ask that the State Department must ensure that Foreign Service officers and detailees and other appropriate staff at U.S. embassies and posts overseas are provided with and required to dedicate sufficient time and resources to develop a thorough understanding of religious freedom conditions in country. This should be beyond the minimum time and resources required to draft respective sections of the annual International Religious Freedom Report. While there are many dedicated State Department personnel who thoroughly invest in these issues, all too often our frontline diplomats are not allowed to or asked to build the necessary networks and expertise to address the many grave religious freedom concerns that exist in their postings. Secondly, we also strongly recommend that President Trump and Secretary Pompeo consider a more robust implementation of the country of particular concern designation provided by the International Religious Freedom Act. By statute, the administration is required to issue these designations 90 days after the issuance of the annual IRF report, released this past Friday. We also urge the administration to seriously weigh options for targeting sanctions against individuals and foreign governments, foreign entities responsible for systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom around the globe. Today, this woman, Zana, has rebuilt her house. It's a small one-room hut, and her husband is buried in that house. She farms her land, and she's thankful to God that she's still alive. Yet she's traumatized, and she deeply misses her husband. She asks for your prayers. There's much more to do to support Zana and others like her, and we look forward to working with the Commission and others in Washington to ensure that her story and others like it are not forgotten. Thank you for this opportunity.
Dr. Curry, thank you very much for your testimony and recommendations to the Commission. Dr. Farr.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for holding the hearing and for your decades of work. How about now? I took off the cover. Was that supposed to be done? Thank you for your holding of the hearing and your decades of service to our country, and especially on behalf of defending religious communities of all religions all over the world. You've asked me to talk a little bit about the persecution of Christians in China and give you some recommendations on U.S. policy, and I'm grateful to be able to do that. The current assault on China's religious minorities under President Xi Jinping is the most comprehensive attempt to manipulate and control religion in China since the Cultural Revolution. Xi's policy is a major contributor to the global crisis in religious persecution, one in which over 3/4 of the world's people live in nations where religion is highly or very highly restricted. Millions of those people are subject to violent repression and persecution, and many studies indicate, as you and Ambassador Brownback have said, you mentioned Pew, there are many others, that numerically Christians are at the top of the list of the victims of persecution around the world. China's persecution of its huge Christian minority provides one major reason why that's the case. Chinese Christians number almost 100 million people. More Christians go to church on Sunday in China than all of Europe put together. It's all the more tragic that their situation is so fragile and is getting worse. Chinese churches, especially house churches, as well as other religious structures such as Catholic Marian shrines, are increasingly being destroyed or shuttered. Pastors, priests, and worshipers are being arrested, imprisoned, and abused. Many Christians are being targeted for harsh and often violent repression. Why is this happening now? There are many reasons, all of them centered in the native communist need to control and maintain power. While the increasing violence against houses of worship and Christians is troubling, I would suggest that President Xi's policy is showcasing a major danger signal, one that gets too little attention, although you mentioned it, Mr. Chairman. China is trying to cut off the growth of Christianity and other religions by, in effect, cutting off the supply line by stopping the religious education of children. Under Xi's policy of the Sinicization of religious education, no child under 18 may attend religious services or any kind of religious event. No one under 18 may receive religious instruction of any kind from anyone. Further, each Chinese religious community is responsible for ensuring its teachings to the young and everyone else are compatible with socialist values and the socialist society, and are supportive of the leadership of the Communist Party. The core values of socialism as practiced in China are exceedingly difficult, to say the least, to square with the core values of Christianity. The Jesuit magazine America has noted correctly that Xi's religious education policy, and I quote, strikes at the very heart and future of the Catholic and other Christian churches, as well as that of other religions. It's an issue of utmost concern for Catholics in China who see it as an attempt by the communist authorities to prevent young people from being educated or growing up in the faith, unquote. Precisely so. The attempt to stop the transmission of Christianity and other religions to Chinese children is a sign of how deadly serious President Xi is. He has not yet adopted Mao Zedong's brutal policies of mass murder, torture, incarceration, and starvation, although his horrific persecution of Uyghur Muslims is coming perilously close. What is to me of most concern for Christians is this education policy. Xi understands that the teachings of Christianity about the dignity of every person, the evil of abortion, and the natural right of every person to religious freedom threaten the rule of the Communist Party. So let me end with a brief set of policy prescriptions for augmenting the growing international outcry against Xi's policy, led by our own Ambassador Brownback, whose critique has been searing, as you heard today. At the Religious Freedom Institute, we argue that if you want to defend Christians or Muslims or Jews or anyone else, you've got to defend the religious freedom of everyone. My written testimony has some detailed practical suggestions about how we might move this communist regime in China toward the idea of greater religious freedom for Christians and Tibetan Buddhists and Uyghur Muslims and others. And I endorse David Curry's recommendations on the Department of State and CPCs. In brief, I suggest countering the natural communist suspicion of all religion by presenting evidence-based self-interest arguments that might appeal to the practical strain in Chinese communism. Ambassador Brownback mentioned this general idea in his testimony about how this idea of self-interest arguments is going to be presented at the ministerial in July. A self-interest argument to China would include the following verifiable propositions. The growth of religion and religious communities is natural and inevitable in all societies. This is why Mao Zedong's policy failed and why religious affiliation is growing in China. Efforts to kill it or blunt its growth are futile and counterproductive. It's just a fact. Religious persecution will retard economic development, increase social instability, and feed violent religious extremism. On the other hand, the accommodation of religious groups will benefit China's economy and increase social harmony and political stability. Elements of this argument have been used episodically by some U.S. officials, but the full argument should now be employed consistently by all U.S. officials, supported by empirical research, encouraged by U.S.-funded programs, and institutionalized in a permanent U.S.-China bilateral working group on religion that studies the positive economics and social effects of religious communities. This new strategy of pragmatic argument stands a chance of actually reducing religious persecution in China, along with the international condemnation and the CPCs. Sustained economic growth is a major priority of Chinese policies, both domestic and international. If Chinese authorities become interested in the country's religious communities as an economic asset and a driver of modernization, rather than as a source of social and political instability, they will be far more open to arguments against persecution. Should it succeed, such a policy would not only improve the status of Christians and other persecuted minorities in China, it would also enhance the positive role that religion can play in blunting the totalitarian impulses so evident in the rule of Xi Jinping. Thank you for having me, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much for your testimony, your insights. And without objection, your full statement will be made a part of the record because it's very rich with insight. Just a few questions. I thank you again for your patience because it has taken a while with the votes to get to this panel. Dr. Curry, your focus, number 2, was rise of nationalist agendas in Asia, and the facts that you've conveyed, nearly 300 churches attacked thus far in 2019 in India is appalling. Maybe you could elaborate on that if you would. USCIRF has suggested that India be put on the watch list. Is it time India went on CPC itself? We know that it's getting worse, and apparently, interesting enough, it was Modi who was barred from coming to the U.S. pursuant to sanctions under URFA for crimes committed against Muslims. So it was lifted, it was waived when he ascended to the head of state for visits here, but that raises a very serious question, that things are getting so much worse. So if you could speak to India, and how does that affect the Dalits, many of whom do become Christians and very strong Christians, and then find themselves being further targeted, not just for their imposed social class and poverty, but also now because they're Christians. On Nigeria, Somalia, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, you speak to as well as to the organizations. One of the things we put into the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act was that the report from IRFA needs to look at organizations like Boko Haram, which were not on the list before. And I think that brings more scrutiny. Maybe it's harder to hold them back because they're not a government, but at least it gets us reporting on them. So thank you for that was one of your key points. And then, of course, communist and post-communist systems. While we haven't stressed North Korea here today, we stress North Korea here today and always do, because it is, as you point out, the worst and most oppressive place on earth to practice religious faith. And I've chaired them and others have chaired them, hearings just on North Korea and how horrific the Kims have been in succession to people of faith, but especially for Christians. So thank you for bringing that forward. One of your points that you make is that the State Department and your recommendations must ensure that Foreign Service officers, detailees, and other appropriate staff at the embassies and posts network and have a thorough understanding of religious freedom conditions. In both Frank Wolf's original bill and then in the one we named after Frank Wolf to honor his tremendous legacy, we put in a full component about training, starting with the ambassador, the DCM, right down to all the Foreign Service officers and others, to make sure that they do understand it. Is it your view, and Dr. Farr, you might want to speak to this as well, that that's not being robustly implemented? But networking is a different issue than just knowing, so you might want to speak to that as well. And then on the issue of sanctions, and thank you for underscoring the need to take these sanctions and apply them. For a long time under Obama's administration, there was not even a designation of CPC. And I held and chaired a few hearings where we heard from USCIRF and others where they said, we're not even getting a designation annually, which I thought was an appalling omission on the part of that administration. Later in the tenure of Mr. Obama, yes, they started doing CPC, but we don't see the sanctions part. And just like our civil rights laws don't work in this country unless there is a predictable consequence for failure, i.e. women's sports, Title IX, if colleges and universities don't do what they, open up sports to women's soccer and the like, they could lose all their funds or a proportionate amount of their funds. So it seems to me your point about urging the administration to seriously weigh options for targeted sanctions, and again, you underscore, and Dr. Farr, you might want to speak to this as well, against individuals and foreign government entities. In the new Frank Wolf law, we put in a provision about having lists of perpetrators of these crimes. Do you find that in our embassies and missions abroad that they're trying to gather that kind of documentation? Who are the ones doing the torture? Who are the ones that are, and then hold them to account by denying them visas and doing other kinds of things. We also have Magnitsky Act Global that could also apply here as a reinforcement because it's already there in the IRFA legislation. And if I could, Dr. Farr, ask you, your point, and I know, this is a very real concern you have raised repeatedly, that the judiciary and the judges, when they're meting out and providing asylum, understand that there is a well-founded fear of persecution in China today for virtually every faith. The crackdown is so extreme and egregious, it's unlike, as you've both said, we've ever seen before, except for Mao Zedong. So if a judge sitting in a courtroom has an asylee applicant in front of him or her and says it's not a problem, they are so woefully misinformed. How do we get the Justice Department, Dr. Farr especially, to change that, provide the guidance that's necessary to our judges so that they make an informed decision for that applicant. I do have a lot of other questions. Vietnam, Dr. Hanford, Dr. Farr, well, I'll get to Vietnam after those questions. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I'll jump in
Please.
and address your question about India. Yes, we do think that India should be on the list of countries of particular concern. Since Prime Minister Modi has taken power, his party, the BJP party, and both in their ideology and in practice, they have really created an environment in India which has seen a tremendous spike in violations of human rights against Christians. It does affect the Dalits within their caste system because they can and do often become Christians. But it also affects other religious minorities as well. And so it is significant when you consider the methodology of the World Watch List, the 6 different areas that we measure, that India reaches number 10 on the list when you have countries like Iran at number 9 and Syria at number 11. It tells you the level of intensity in India. Regarding Nigeria and countries like that and how non-state actors like Boko Haram, I think also we need to consider the Fulani and their effect. That's part of what makes it so difficult is you have two totally different groups, but with a very similar ideology that are attacking Christians. And so obviously anything that can be done to increase pressure on the government to take those non-state actors seriously. And that's, I think, the concern and the puzzlement that we have is that there does not seem to be an effective response on behalf of the government, and perhaps pressure in that way would be very helpful. Regarding State Department training, and then I'll pass it over to Dr. Farr, I think that obviously the training of foreign officials was a giant step forward. Yes, I am suggesting that a deeper knowledge and understanding beyond a baseline training, I think we now know needs to happen, because when these folks are considering crisis mapping within their regions, they need to understand it's more than just gang violence, corruption, and these things, although certainly those are parts of it, but the religious culture within Nigeria, within many of these regions on the World Watch List and on the other lists that were mentioned here today, is often the first and significant driver in some of this violence. Thank you.
Thank you for all those questions, Mr. Chairman. If I might just very briefly say a word on the Dalits in India. The Religious Freedom Institute has an office in India now, and one of our major colleagues, Rebecca Shaw, focuses on the Dalits and how religious freedom. She has done empirical research, major project on how religious freedom affects these, particularly women, all over South Asia, but especially the Dalits of India. And perhaps not surprisingly, we spend a lot of our time, it seems to me, proving with statistics what we know to be true, and that is that religious freedom gives people an agency, a sense of self-worth that allows them to be not only happy people, but economically productive people. And many of these women have micro businesses. And so we're making, again, the self-interest argument there about this. Leave these people alone. That doesn't, you don't have to say religious freedom, just back off and leave people alone. We're very excited about some of this research, which is an example of how you can get to the resistance on something. On the training, I agree with everything David said. It is useful to remember how bad it once was. It is better. I mean, 21 years ago, there was very little. There was one day of training. It was good. It was good. I don't want to criticize it, but it was voluntary, and it happened once a year, and trying to get people to come to it was really hard. And now we do have, particularly under Sam Brownback, but also under his predecessor, as you've noted, Ambassador Saperstein, an increase in the regularity of training. But I agree, we need to take it to another step. But I just kudos not only to Ambassador Brownback, but to Dan Nadell and others in his office who have developed not only at FSI, but some regional training. So this is a matter of keeping keeping the momentum going. And I entirely agree with David's recommendation. Just a word on the lists under the Wolf Amendment, perpetrators of crime. I mean, this is a perfect example of what you were talking about with the targeted sanctions and judiciously implemented sanctions. These are people that should be sanctioned, and we are, as far as I know, these lists are being developed. I would like to see more, because this brings attention to the issue, and it highlights the people that are really doing the damage on the ground. Finally, if I could just respond to the troubling issue of the 10th Circuit's findings and the judges that you mentioned. I mean, the 10th Circuit in the United States was faced with the case of Shin Sui, a Chinese man who was, because he was a Christian, was arrested, was beaten, was put in jail for 4 nights, forced to go to re-education, a small version of what's going on in Xinjiang province now in these re-education camps. He was warned not to attend illegal church meetings, which means church services, and was given a major fine. And when faced with all of this, the judges in the 10th Circuit said, well, this is bad, but it doesn't rise to the level of persecution. What does the English language mean if being beaten, fined, imprisoned, and told not to go to church is not religious persecution? This still stands as a standard within the 10th Circuit. So here's the answer. The Attorney General has the authority to overturn this. The training you referenced is very important, and I was honored to join Judge Ken Starr in doing a training session for immigration judges about a year ago. But now, Judge Starr and others are seeking a meeting with the Attorney General, who has the authority to overturn this standard, which is just complete nonsense, and it does not accord with the American protection of the free exercise of religion. And thank you for your involvement in this, Mr. Smith, which is very helpful.
Thank you. I just have a few questions, and we'll let you go. Thanks again for what you've provided. Dr. Farr, you talked about, and I think it needs to be underscored because it is so grossly underappreciated by Congress, by perhaps some people in the executive branch, but the whole idea of synodization. And as you point out, under this policy, no child under 18 may attend religious services or any kind of religious event. No one under 18 may receive religious education of any kind from anyone. Maybe just if you could just add a few points to just how draconian this is, how it violates international norms and treaties, a couple of which the Chinese government has acceded to. Where do they come off in just so brazenly violating this right to conscience, the freedom of religion? And you might want to comment, if you would, on whether or not the Vatican is perhaps reappraising its agreement, which I thought was not helpful, to convey the ability of Beijing to pick bishops and the right of refusal or veto power being retained by the Vatican. I mean, when did that happen? As you know, I've known a lot of underground Christians in general, including bishops, but Protestants as well. And they are the most courageous people on the face of the earth. Many of them felt that they were undermined by that agreement, but it's not panning out very well. As you pointed out in a previous testimony, there's been a deterioration even in the Catholic relationship with Xi Jinping. And in her testimony, Ms. Mainza had said, and she spoke to Pakistan, CPC, glad it was put on CPC, and then said sanctions were waived. To your point, Dr. Curry, again about, sanctions need to be sanctions, they need to be used, and they need to be used obviously judiciously, but they need to be used. How do we admonish the administration to say enough is enough? Waivers, and I know for a fact, I've been here 39 years, every human rights bill I write always has to have waivers, or the White House will not sign it, period. So we put in waivers to give them flexibility, hopefully to make a good faith call that the waivers are either counterproductive for what we're trying to do, in this case religious freedom, or has a national security interest involvement, but they're just used almost with impunity by whomever is in the White House. So if you could speak to that, and particularly to Pakistan, I appreciate it.
Well, just very briefly on the education, taking the education of children away from their parents is in violation of every international treaty that I'm aware of, including ones that the Chinese have signed, the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, for example. They've signed it, they haven't ratified it. Every standard that one can imagine, this violates. But as I mentioned in my testimony, what really worries me about this is it shows how serious the Chinese are about, if you want to kill an entity, if you want to strangle it without appearing to do so, you just cut off the supply. You set up ways to prevent the young from learning. Now, of course, parents are teaching in their homes, but they do so at their own peril. And to be a Christian without the opportunity as a child to go to church with your parents is a terrible thing. And it's true for Muslims and Buddhist temples and the like as well. So this tells me that something, it's always been out there. It's been out there a little bit. I mean, it's not a completely new issue, but it's going to another level now that is very worrying to me. On the Vatican, excuse me for chuckling, I am, to put it as nicely as I can, befuddled at why the Vatican concluded this accord. And at a prior testimony, Mr. Smith, I mentioned that I feared that this was a return to the foreign policy of the Vatican before Pope John Paul came in, which was called a policy of realpolitik, but in fact, it was a problem of enemy identification, as far as I was concerned, a failure to understand the evils of communism and the fundamentally anti-Catholic and anti-Christian premises of these people. So to just sign an accord that in effect allows Beijing to participate in the choosing of Catholic bishops, Catholics have to have bishops, is a very bad idea on its face. And as you mentioned, the payoff since the finalization of this accord has been very, very bad. So I'm hoping, I have no inside information, but I am hoping that the Vatican is reassessing not only this accord, but going to what was supposed to be the next step after this diplomatic victory, and that is recognizing Beijing as the capital of China. I think that step should not be taken. Indeed, the accord should be looked at. I'll let David talk about the waivers issue.
Yes, Pakistan is number 5 on the world watch list. And again, you know, the way we score these based on levels of violence, pressure at the family level, pressure at the private level, whether a person has the ability to make up their own mind what they believe. That's part of the scoring thing. The national level, the community level. When you get a country like Pakistan, they are severe violators of human rights. There are millions of Christians in Pakistan who have no freedom. There are even more Muslims and other individuals who maybe want to read a Bible and decide for themselves what they think or to change their faith. That does not happen in Pakistan. I think sanctions are the reasonable way to address this. People take them serious. If Pakistan wants to be part of the international community, it's something we need to take, I think, as a necessary step.
One last question. Are there any deficiencies in law that we need to address? Any? And you can take this back if you want and get back to the commission of what we might do if there are those. I mean, part of what we're trying to do now is make sure current law is enforced as aggressively as possible and as faithfully as possible. But if there's anything that we didn't get with the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act reauthorization, it would be very helpful to hear that either now or in the near future.
I will send you some written stuff, Mr. Smith, but if I could, just one very quick one, and that is Foreign Service officers have cones. They are trained, they're like branches in the Army, specialties.
Yes.
For some time, I've thought it would be a good idea to have a religious freedom specialty. This should not, in my view, be a standalone specialty, but should be embedded in either the political or the economic cones of the Foreign Service. There's an idea for you. I'm happy to provide a bit more on that and some other things as well. If I might very briefly just say one other thing about the Vatican and then address the waivers question that you asked. The Holy Father has been heroic in calling out religious persecution against all people. So my comments were about the foreign ministry, if you will, of the Vatican. I have a lot of experience with foreign ministries and their capacity to move in a direction that they want to move in, rather than the direction that the country itself needs to move in. And I think my own view is that's what's happening here. It is the diplomats around the Holy Father that have led this accord in the wrong direction. They're very talented men. Many of them are very, very important and very, very holy priests. They've just gotten this one wrong. And finally, I would just say the waivers have become the tail that wagged the dog. I mean, you had to put them in there in order to get them there, but just I would argue, keep up the pressure on not just waiving it without even thinking about it. As you know, it says for important national interest, waivers for important national interest. You could elevate that if you wanted to whatever the next level is, not just waiving because important U.S. interests are involved, but vital national interests or words to that effect. There's some legal language. You could consider that as a
Thank you.
a legal amendment.
And I'll conclude by just, unless there's anything you'd like to add, thanking you very, very profoundly for your leadership. Let the record know that when we were writing the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act, your input was key to provision after provision after provision. We counted on both of your expertise, and we got, I think, a very good bill signed by President Trump. And of course, we named it after Frank Wolf, who has a legacy second to none on religious freedom. So thank you for your leadership. Look forward to those recommendations, as well as the recommendations for what we should be doing now to make all of this work more effectively. This hearing is adjourned, and I thank you again.